Most Disney princes end up the same way: tragedy, they become addicts, they go insane, or they die alone. But Kevin Corcoran is an exception. He beats the house. He realized a terrifying truth that other kids don't see. His golden ticket to the Magic Kingdom is actually a summons to a gilded cage. Being loved by Walt Disney is not a blessing, it's a sentence. So what did Kevin do? He didn't wait to be fired. He planned the greatest escape in Hollywood. He spent 50 years of his life not chasing the limelight, but running away from it. This is the story of a kid who saw through the meat grinder of the entertainment industry and was smart enough to jump off the conveyor belt before the blade collapsed. Unraveling the reason a man would bury his legacy requires revisiting the world that built the pedestal he stood on. We must go back to the beginning, to the factory of innocence that was post-war Hollywood. The era that birthed Kevin Corcoran's stardom was a time of profound psychological whiplash. The United States had just emerged from the two greatest traumas in human history, the Great Depression and World War II. A generation of men had returned from the Pacific and Europe, having seen the absolute worst of humanity. They had seen concentration camps, firebombed cities, and the beaches of Normandy. They returned home with a singular, overwhelming desire: quiet. They didn't want revolution. They didn't want complexity. They wanted a lawn. They wanted a fence. They wanted a wife who smiled and children who were safe. This collective trauma birthed the American suburbs: Levittown, Lakewood, the sprawling grids of identical houses that promised a life of predictable, rhythmic peace. But peace is boring, and children by their nature are agents of chaos. The parents of the 1950s found themselves in a bind. They wanted to raise children who were obedient and good, reflecting the moral victory of the war. Yet they also wanted their children to have the spunk and spirit that defined American individualism. They wanted Huckleberry Finn, but they wanted him to wash his hands for dinner. Into this cultural vacuum stepped a man who understood the American psyche better than any politician or general: Walt Disney. By the early 1950s, Walt Disney was ceasing to be merely a producer of cartoons. He was becoming the high priest of the American family. With the opening of Disneyland in 1955 and the dominance of his television show, Disneyland, he was crafting a comprehensive worldview. The Disney way was safe, sanitized, and optimistic. But Walt had a problem. Animation was expensive and slow. To truly conquer the new medium of television and the expanding film market, he needed live action. He needed real humans. He tried with perfect children. The early Mickey Mouse Club cast members were polished. They could tap dance. They could sing in perfect harmony. They were like beautiful animatronic dolls. But Walt, with his uncanny instinct for the audience's pulse, knew that perfect was alienating. Perfect was cold. He needed a rough edge. He needed dirt under the fingernails. He needed a child who looked like he might have a slingshot in his back pocket. He needed someone who could bridge the gap between the pristine fantasy of Disney and the messy reality of the playground. He didn't know it yet, but he was looking for a Corcoran. In the annals of Hollywood history, there are famous families: the Barrymores, the Fondas, the Baldwins. But in the 1950s, in the trenches of the casting offices, there was the Corcoran clan. Kevin was not a singular biological anomaly. He was part of a fleet. Bill and Kathleen Corcoran were the patriarch and matriarch of a sprawling, boisterous Irish Catholic family that would eventually number 8 children. They lived in a modest home in California, but their ambitions were anything but modest. It is easy, through the lens of modern cynicism, to look at the Corcoran parents and label them as exploitative. We have been conditioned by the horror stories of Judy Garland's mother or Michael Jackson's father to see stage parents as monsters wielding whips and withholding love. But the Corcoran dynamic was more complex and perhaps more insidious because of its normalcy. Bill Corcoran worked in security at MGM Studios. He wasn't a failed actor living vicariously through his kids. He was a blue-collar worker who saw the movie industry not as an art form, but as a trade. To Bill, acting was like plumbing or carpentry. It was work. And in a family of 8 children, everyone had to pull their weight. The Corcoran household was run with the logistics of a small military unit. Transportation had to be coordinated. Casting calls were strategic operations. Money was pooled. The children were not just siblings. They were colleagues. They were competitors. The Corcoran dinner table was less a place for domestic bliss and more a strategic command center. It wasn't just about passing the potatoes. It was about passing the torch of success. Did you get the part? Was as common a question as, did you finish your homework? In this environment, a child learns very quickly that attention is a finite resource. In a family of 8, you don't get noticed by being quiet. You don't get noticed by being average. You get noticed by being the loudest, the funniest, or the most successful. Kevin, born on June 10, 1949, landed right in the middle of this competitive scrum. He wasn't the eldest, carrying the burden of leadership. He wasn't the baby, coddled and protected. He was in the messy middle. He had to fight for his oxygen. This middle child syndrome is often cited as a negative, but for Kevin, it was a forge. It hardened him. It taught him how to insert himself into a conversation. It taught him how to take a punch, metaphorically and literally, from his brothers. It gave him a scrappiness that the only children of Beverly Hills simply couldn't manufacture. By the time he was a toddler, the family business was already in full swing. His sister, Noreen, was arguably the first star of the family, landing a major role in the sitcom Bachelor Father. Her success proved that it was possible. It put a tangible target on the wall for the other kids. If Noreen can do it, why can't I? So the Corcoran station wagon became a fixture on the boulevards of Los Angeles, shuttling various combinations of children to various studios. Kevin was dragged along, often just a passenger on his siblings' auditions. He sat in waiting rooms, watching other kids practice their smiles, watching mothers fuss over bow ties. He absorbed the atmosphere of the industry before he could even read a script. He learned the smell of the grease paint, the sound of the bell signaling quiet on the set, the tension of the casting director's gaze. He wasn't trained in a drama school. He was trained in the trenches. What made Kevin different? Why, out of thousands of children in Los Angeles, did he rise? The child actors of the 1950s generally fell into 2 categories. First, there were the beautiful dolls. These were kids with cherubic faces, golden curls, and the ability to weep on cue. They were used for melodrama. They were fragile. Second, there were the miniature adults. These were the kids who were precocious, who spoke with perfect diction, who acted like tiny 40-year-olds. They were used for sitcoms to deliver witty one-liners. Kevin fit neither category. He wasn't breathtakingly beautiful in a fragile way. He looked like a potato that had been left out in the sun, earthy, solid, and real. And he certainly wasn't a miniature adult. He was aggressively, undeniably a child. He had a quality that casting directors call readability. When Kevin felt something, it was plastered across his face. If he was bored, he looked bored. If he was angry, he scowled. He lacked the filter that most children are taught to install by age 5. This lack of a filter was dangerous in polite society, but it was gold on celluloid. The camera loves truth, and Kevin Corcoran was incapable of lying. His early roles were small, uncredited blips on the radar. He appeared in the film The Glenn Miller Story and Untamed. He was just a kid, a prop in the background to make a scene look populated. But in 1956, the call came from Burbank. Disney was casting. They weren't just looking for a specific role, they were looking for stock players. Walt Disney was building a repertory company of children, a stable of talent that he could rotate through his various television and film projects. This was the studio system in its twilight years, but Disney kept it alive longer than anyone else. Being signed to Disney meant you belonged to them. They owned your image, your weekends, and your haircut. Kevin went to the audition. He didn't tap dance. He didn't sing an aria. He stood on his mark, looked at the camera, and likely made a wisecrack. He had a gravelly voice that sounded like he'd been smoking cigars since infancy. Legend has it that when Walt Disney reviewed the screen tests, he stopped at Kevin. He didn't see a polished actor. He saw a nuisance. He saw the kid who lived down the street and threw baseballs through your window. That one, Walt reportedly indicated, he's real. Kevin was cast in a serial for the Mickey Mouse Club called Adventures in Dairyland. It sounds quaint now, a show about dairy farming. It was educational propaganda designed to teach city kids where milk came from. It starred two of Disney's biggest teen stars, Annette Funicello and Sammy Ogg. Kevin was given a minor role, a sidekick, a pest. His character's name was Moochie. The name itself was ridiculous. Moochie. It sounds soft, pliable, but Kevin played him like a buzzsaw. From the moment he stepped on screen in Dairyland, the dynamic shifted. The older kids were reciting lines, Kevin was shouting them. He improvised, he mugged for the camera. He had an energy that threatened to derail the entire educational purpose of the show. He was the anarchy in the milk barn, and the audience loved him. The letters started pouring in. Kids didn't want to know about pasteurization. They wanted to know what Moochie was going to do next. Was Moochie going to fall in the milk vat? Was Moochie going to fight the cow? Walt Disney, ever the astute businessman, recognized that he had accidentally discovered a star. He realized that Kevin Corcoran tapped into a very specific archetype, the little brother. Every family in America had a Moochie. He was the kid who tagged along when you wanted to be with your friends. He was the kid who asked embarrassing questions at dinner. He was the kid you ostensibly loved but secretly wanted to lock in the closet. By giving this archetype a face and a name, Disney created a mascot for sibling annoyance. But for Kevin, this was the beginning of the trap. He wasn't Kevin Corcoran anymore. He wasn't the son of Bill and Kathleen. He was Moochie. The name followed him everywhere. When he walked down the street in Burbank, people yelled, "Hey, Moochie." When he went to Mass on Sunday, parishioners whispered, "Look, it's Moochie." At 6 years old, you don't understand the concept of branding. You don't understand that your identity is being harvested and sold. You just know that when you make the funny face, people laugh. And when people laugh, your father is happy, your mother is proud. And the nice man with the mustache named Mr. Disney gives you a pat on the head. It is a dopamine loop that is nearly impossible to break. But as 1956 turned to 1957, the stakes were about to rise dramatically. The Mickey Mouse Club was TV. It was popular, but it was fleeting. Disney was preparing to make a move that would cement his legacy in cinema history. He was preparing to adapt a novel by Fred Gibson about a frontier family and a yellow dog. He needed a cast. He needed a family that looked like they belonged in the Texas dirt of the 1860s. He needed a younger brother who could hold his own against a rabid wolf and a weeping audience. He didn't hold auditions for the role of Arliss Coates. He didn't need to. He knew he had the perfect rough-and-tumble kid right there on the lot. The boy in the backwards cap was about to trade his baseball glove for a bag of rocks and walk into cinematic immortality. The era of Moochie was ending. The era of the Disney legend was about to begin. But as Kevin stood on the precipice of this massive fame, Nobody told him the cost of admission. Nobody told him that the higher he climbed, the harder it would be to ever come back down to earth and just be Kevin again. The lights were set, the camera was rolling, and the machine was hungry. The year 1957 was a turning point, not just for the Walt Disney Studio, but for the cultural fabric of America. When production began on Old Yeller, the atmosphere on the lot shifted from the whimsical fantasy of animation to the gritty, dusty reality of live-action drama. The sound stages in Burbank were transformed to mimic the rough terrain of the Texas Hill Country in the late 1860s. The air filled with the smell of livestock, dirt, and sweat. This was no place for polished, tap-dancing children. It was a place for a boy who wasn't afraid to get blood on his knees. Kevin Corcoran, then only 8 years old, walked onto this set not with the trepidation of an actor facing a daunting dramatic challenge, but with the casual energy of a kid walking onto a playground. He was cast as Arliss Coates, the younger brother of the film's protagonist, Travis. If Travis, played by the soulful and intense Tommy Kirk, was the film's moral center, then Arliss was its chaotic heart. Arliss was pure impulse. He was the catalyst for the entire plot. It was Arliss who first accepted the stray yellow dog. It was Arliss who threw rocks at bears. It was Arliss who embodied the reckless, untamed spirit of the frontier childhood. Director Robert Stevenson, a man of immense patience and skill, quickly realized that directing Kevin Corcoran was less about giving him motivation and more about containment. You didn't tell Kevin how to act like a mischievous boy. You simply pointed the camera at him and tried to keep him in focus. In the iconic scene where Arliss tries to capture a toad or tangles with the local wildlife, there is no artifice in Kevin's eyes. He isn't thinking about his lighting or his camera angles. He is simply a boy, lost in the fascination of the moment. This authenticity was the film's secret weapon. Old Yeller is remembered as a tragedy, the story of the dog who had to be shot. But the tragedy only works because the joy that precedes it feels so genuine. Kevin provided that joy. He was the comic relief that lowered the audience's defenses. His raspy voice, his constant demands for food, his pockets full of snakes and horned toads, these weren't just character traits. They were the texture of life. He made the Coates family feel real. He made them feel like neighbors. When the film was released in December 1957, the reaction was seismic. It didn't just perform well, it traumatized and captivated an entire generation. In theaters from New York to California, the sound of weeping became the soundtrack of the winter. But amidst the tears for the dog, there was a collective embrace of the little boy. Kevin Corcoran became the nation's little brother. He wasn't an idol to be worshipped from afar. He was a family member to be protected. The success of Old Yeller solidified Kevin's position within the Disney hierarchy. He was no longer just a mouseketeer or a day player. He was a movie star. But unlike the adult stars of the time, the Cary Grants or the John Waynes, Kevin's stardom was strange. He didn't have fans who wanted his autograph so much as he had fans who wanted to adopt him. He was public property in a way that was uniquely invasive. Back on the Disney lot in Burbank, life for Kevin settled into a surreal rhythm. To the outside world, it was a dream factory, but to Kevin, it was just school and work. He attended the studio schoolhouse, a small building tucked away on the lot where the child actors received their state-mandated education. It was a bizarre classroom. His classmates were Annette Funicello, Tommy Kirk, and the other Mouseketeers. They studied algebra and history while wearing cowboy costumes or mouse ears. They discussed homework in between takes of scenes where they fought pirates or discovered treasure. In this insular world, a hierarchy emerged, and Kevin sat near the very top. He possessed a kind of diplomatic immunity. Most employees on the lot, from the animators to the janitors, walked in fear of Walt Disney. Walt was a benevolent figure, yes, but he was also a titan, a man whose raised eyebrow could end a career. He was the boss. But to Kevin Corcoran, he was just Walt. There are stories whispered by old-timers on the lot of Kevin wandering freely into Walt's office. This was the sanctum sanctorum, the nerve center of the empire. Executives would straighten their ties and sweat through their shirts before entering. Kevin would stroll in, hop up on the desk, and ask Walt what he was drawing. Walt, a man who famously curated his public image as the kindly Uncle Walt, found a genuine kinship with Kevin. Perhaps it was because Kevin wanted nothing from him. Kevin didn't care about stock prices or box office receipts. He cared about whether there was ice cream in the commissary. In a life filled with yes men and terrified subordinates, Kevin's blunt honesty was a breath of fresh air. Walt dubbed him Moochie, not just on screen, but in life. It was a term of endearment, but it was also a label that reinforced a specific behavior. Kevin learned quickly that being Moochie, being loud, being brash, being slightly troublesome, was the key to love. It was the currency of his existence. When he acted out, the most powerful man in Hollywood laughed. When he made a scene, he got a close-up. The psychological conditioning was absolute. The world was telling him, don't change, don't grow up. Stay exactly as you are. Disney wasted no time in capitalizing on this new asset. If Old Yeller proved Kevin could handle drama, the studio wanted to see if he could carry a comedy. In 1959, they released The Shaggy Dog. It was the first live-action comedy for the studio, a genre experiment that would define Disney for the next 2 decades. The plot was absurd. A teenage boy turns into a sheepdog. But the secret sauce of the movie was, once again, Kevin Corcoran. He played Moochie Daniels. He was the younger brother who discovers the secret. In The Shaggy Dog, Kevin was unleashed. He was the audience surrogate, the only one who seemed to understand the insanity of the situation. His comedic timing was impeccable. He had a way of delivering a line, deadpan, raspy, skeptical, that cut through the saccharine sweetness of the 1950s sitcom style. He was cynical before his time. The film was a monster hit. It grossed more than Ben-Hur relative to its budget. It essentially funded the studio's operations for the next year, and it cemented Kevin's typecast. He was now officially and legally Moochie to the world, but with The Shaggy Dog, a subtle shift began to occur. The character of Moochie was becoming a caricature. In Old Yeller, Arliss had been a real boy living on the frontier. In The Shaggy Dog, Moochie was a sitcom trope. He was the annoying little brother. The writers began to write for the persona. They gave him catchphrases. They engineered scenes specifically for him to be a nuisance. Kevin, a professional even at age 10, delivered exactly what was asked. He hit his marks. He mugged for the camera. He learned that a scrunched nose got a laugh, so he scrunched his nose. He learned that a loud shout got attention, so he shouted. He was becoming a master technician of his own cuteness. Yet amidst the laughter and the box office records, there were quiet moments of isolation. Being the Moochie meant you were always the sidekick. You were never the hero. You were the obstacle the hero had to overcome or the mess the hero had to clean up. In the narrative of his own life, Kevin was being positioned as a supporting character. By 1960, the demand for Kevin Corcoran was at its peak. He was working almost nonstop. When he wasn't filming a movie, he was doing promotional tours. He was shaking hands with mayors. He was cutting ribbons at supermarkets. He was the face of American childhood, a childhood that was energetic, safe, and commercially viable. Disney decided it was time to give him a vehicle of his own. No longer the little brother, they cast him as the lead in Toby Tyler. It was a film about a boy who runs away to join the circus. The metaphor was almost too perfect. Kevin had been living in a circus since he was a toddler. Toby Tyler was a test. Could Kevin Corcoran carry a movie without Tommy Kirk? Could he hold the screen alone? The answer was a resounding yes. Kevin carried the film with a surprising amount of pathos. The story required him to be vulnerable, to be lonely, to be scared, emotions that Moochie rarely displayed. There is a scene in Toby Tyler where he bonds with a monkey named Mr. Stubbs. It sounds ridiculous on paper, but on screen, it is heartbreaking. Kevin plays the scene with a profound gentleness. It was a glimpse of the actor he could become, a glimpse of the depth that lay beneath the backwards baseball cap. But Toby Tyler, despite its success, was the beginning of the end of the golden era. It was the peak of the mountain, and from the peak, the only way is down. As 1960 rolled into 1961, biology began to assert its ruthless dominance. Kevin was 11, then 12. The round cheeks began to flatten. The legs began to grow lanky. The voice, that trademark raspy weapon of mass destruction, began to crack and waver. On the Disney lot, the adults watched these changes with a clinical eye. They were not watching a boy grow into a young man. They were watching an asset depreciate. The cute factor is a perishable commodity. It has a shelf life like milk. And Kevin Corcoran was approaching his expiration date. He filmed Pollyanna and Swiss Family Robinson back to back. These were massive productions, the blockbusters of their day. In Swiss Family Robinson, filmed on location in the humidity of Tobago, Kevin played Francis, the animal-collecting youngest son. It was the ultimate boy fantasy, living in a treehouse, fighting pirates, riding ostriches. For Kevin, the shoot in Tobago was a moment of supreme freedom. Far away from the Burbank lot, far away from the schoolhouse, he was living an adventure that most kids only read about in books. He was a prince in a tropical kingdom. But even in paradise, the shadows were lengthening. He was growing out of his costumes faster than the wardrobe department could sew them. The directors had to frame shots differently to hide his height. The writers struggled to write lines that fit a boy who was clearly entering puberty but was still expected to act like a 6-year-old. The cognitive dissonance was setting in. Kevin felt like a fraud. He knew he wasn't Moochie anymore. He was interested in girls. He was interested in cars. He was interested in the mechanics of the camera. But every time the director yelled action, he had to shrink. He had to regress. He had to put on the mask of the mischievous toddler that the world demanded. It is a specific kind of psychological torture to be forced to perform a version of your past self for money. It creates a fracture in the psyche. Who am I? Am I Kevin, or am I just a vessel for Moochie? While his co-stars like Tommy Kirk were struggling with their own demons of sexuality and identity, Kevin's struggle was existential. He was fighting against time itself. And in Hollywood, time always wins. The sun was setting on the 1950s. The era of Eisenhower, of picket fences, of simple answers, was dying. The 1960s were coming, a storm of revolution, rock and roll, and cynicism. And in this approaching storm, there was very little room for a boy named Moochie. The factory of innocence had produced its masterpiece in Kevin Corcoran, but it had no plan for what to do with the masterpiece when it started to crack. The machine kept running, but the gears were beginning to grind. Kevin was about to learn the hardest lesson of show business. You are only loved as long as you are useful. And his utility was running out. The year 1961 arrived not with a bang, but with a strange, dissonant hum. The United States was inaugurating John F. Kennedy, a young, handsome president who promised a new frontier. The cultural temperature was rising. There was a sense of forward motion, of satellites orbiting the Earth and freedom riders boarding buses in the South. But in Burbank, inside the sound stages of Walt Disney productions, the clocks were stubbornly set to 1955. Kevin Corcoran was now 12 years old. In the biology of a normal child, 12 is a threshold. It is the beginning of the end of childhood. It is the age of cracking voices, awkward limbs, and the first stirrings of rebellion. But in the biology of a Disney star, 12 is a crisis. It is the moment when the asset begins to depreciate. The roundness of Kevin's face, the very geometric quality that had made Moochie a national icon, was beginning to lengthen. The mischievous sparkle in his eyes was being replaced by the guarded, slightly weary look of a professional who had been working 6-day weeks for half a decade. The studio's solution to this biological inconvenience was denial. They decided to simply ignore the fact that Kevin was growing up. They continued to cast him in roles that demanded the same wide-eyed, raspy-voiced innocence he had delivered at age 7. In 1961, he appeared in Babes in Toyland, a Technicolor extravaganza intended to be Disney's answer to The Wizard of Oz. Kevin played Boy Blue. He was dressed in a costume that felt increasingly like a straitjacket. Bright colors, storybook innocence, a nursery rhyme brought to life. Watching the film today, there is an uncanny valley effect to his performance. He is delivering the lines with his usual professionalism, but the spirit is different. He looks like a boy who knows he is too old to be wearing the costume. There is a tension behind the eyes, a subconscious signal to the audience that the game is almost up. The critics, usually kind to the studio's golden boy, began to sharpen their knives. They noted that the cuteness was feeling forced. They noted that Moochie was starting to look like a teenager playing dress-up. This is the cruelty of the child star's trajectory. The audience falls in love with a snapshot of a person. When that person evolves, the audience feels betrayed. They didn't want Kevin Corcoran, the developing young man. They wanted Moochie, the static object. They wanted the comfort of familiarity. Every inch Kevin grew was a betrayal of that contract. In 1962, the studio shipped him off to France to film Bon Voyage. It was a prestigious project, starring Fred MacMurray and Jane Wyman, detailing the adventures of an American family touring Europe. On the surface, it was another dream job. Kevin was traveling the world, staying in fine hotels, dining in Paris, but the subtext of the film mirrored his own reality. He was playing the younger brother again, Skippy Willard, but the plot mechanics were beginning to creak. The mischief that was charming in a toddler looked bordering on delinquent in a teenager. During the filming in France, Walt Disney himself visited the set. The dynamic between the patriarch and his favorite pet had shifted. Kevin was no longer the little boy who could hop on Walt's desk and ask for candy. He was a young man in a suit. The conversations were polite, but the intimacy was evaporating. Walt was a man who adored the potential of childhood. He was far less interested in the complications of adolescence. He didn't know how to write for teenagers. To Walt, teenagers were a problem to be solved, usually by turning them into shaggy dogs or placing them in situations where they learned to respect their elders. He didn't have a roadmap for Kevin's future because, in Walt's mind, Moochie wasn't supposed to have a future. He was supposed to stay 6 years old forever. The breaking point came in 1963 with the release of Savage Sam. Savage Sam was the sequel to Old Yeller. On paper, it was a guaranteed hit. It reunited the original team, Kevin Corcoran as Arliss Coates and Tommy Kirk as his older brother Travis. It brought back the frontier setting. It brought back the dog. It was an attempt to clone the lightning that had struck in 1957. But 1963 was not 1957. The world had lost its innocence, and so had the actors. Tommy Kirk was 21, struggling with his sexuality and drug use, forcing himself to play a naive pioneer boy. Kevin Corcoran was 14, his voice now a fluctuating baritone, trying to recapture the chaotic energy of little Arliss. The film was darker, more violent, and strangely hollow. There is a scene where Kevin and Tommy are captured by Apaches. It was meant to be thrilling, but it felt discordant. Seeing these two young men, who were clearly adults or near adults, playing out a cowboys and Indians fantasy that belonged to a previous decade, highlighted just how out of touch the studio was becoming. The box office reflected this. Savage Sam didn't flop, but it didn't soar. It was a relic upon arrival. It was during the production of Savage Sam that Kevin began to truly understand the precariousness of his position. He watched Tommy Kirk closely. Tommy was the big brother in every sense, the star Kevin looked up to, the path Kevin was expected to follow. But Kevin saw the cracks in Tommy's armor. He saw the shaking hands. He saw the glassy eyes. He saw the terror of a young man who knows he is living a lie. When Tommy was unceremoniously fired by Disney the following year due to his sexuality, the message was broadcast loud and clear to every person on the lot. You are disposable. It didn't matter how much money you made for the company. It didn't matter if Walt called you his good luck charm. If you became a problem or if you simply ceased to fit the mold, you would be erased. Kevin took this lesson into his marrow. He realized that the love he received from the studio was conditional. It was a transaction. And his side of the transaction, his youth, was running out. He had one final stand to make. In 1964, he starred in A Tiger Walks. It was a departure from the slapstick comedies. It was a drama about a tiger escaping a circus and the panic it causes in a small town. Kevin played a boy who wants to save the tiger, arguing that the animal isn't evil, just scared. The metaphor was screamingly obvious. Kevin was the tiger. He was the wild thing that the town wanted to put down because it couldn't control him anymore. His performance in A Tiger Walks is arguably the best of his career. There is a gravity to it. He isn't mugging for the camera. He isn't doing the moochy face. He is acting. He is tapping into the sadness and the frustration of a boy who feels misunderstood by the adults around him. But the film was buried. It was released in the shadow of a new phenomenon that was sweeping the Disney lot, Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins, released in 1964, marked the beginning of a new era for Disney. It was sophisticated. It was British. It starred Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke. It was a massive, critically acclaimed musical that made the old live-action westerns and slapstick comedies look like dusty antiques. Kevin Corcoran, the rough-and-tumble American boy, the kid with the dirt on his face, didn't fit in this new world of magical nannies and dancing penguins. He was an artifact of the Uncle Walt era, and the company was moving toward corporate synergy and blockbuster spectacles. The phone call stopped. It wasn't a sudden slam of the door. It was a slow, agonizing silence. The scripts that used to pile up on his parents' kitchen table dwindled to a trickle, and then to nothing. There were no meetings to discuss his future. There was no transition plan. The contract simply ran out, and it wasn't renewed. Kevin was 15 years old. He had worked for 10 years. He had generated millions of dollars in revenue, and he was retired. Most people get to retire at 65 after a lifetime of labor. Kevin Corcoran was forced into retirement before he could legally drive a car. The psychological impact of this void cannot be overstated. Consider the crushing weight of spending an entire conscious life defined by one thing, being a star, only to wake up one Tuesday morning to find that definition has been deleted. You still have the face. You still have the name, but you don't have the purpose. He went to a regular high school. This in itself was a surreal nightmare. He walked the halls of a Catholic high school in Los Angeles, surrounded by kids who had grown up watching him. To them, he wasn't a peer, he was a celebrity. He was a curiosity. Hey, Moochie, do the face. Hey, Moochie, where's Old Yeller? He was bullied, not physically perhaps, but existentially. He was isolated by his own fame. He couldn't just be Kevin. He was a walking museum exhibit of 1950s pop culture. Girls wanted to date him because of who he was, not who he really was. Teachers treated him with a mix of deference and skepticism. He began to hate the name Moochie. He hated the sound of it. It felt like a slur. It was a reminder of the clown suit he had been forced to wear. He wanted to burn the baseball cap. He wanted to scream at people that Moochie was dead, but he didn't scream. He didn't fight back with fists. He retreated. He observed. This is the pivotal moment where Kevin's path diverged from the tragic trajectory of his peers. When the silence descended, he didn't try to fill it with noise. He didn't turn to drugs to replicate the dopamine rush of fame. He didn't start robbing liquor stores or driving fast cars off cliffs. Instead, he looked at his father. Bill Corcoran was a pragmatic man. He had never treated Kevin's acting as anything other than a job. You go to work, you do your job, you come home. That was the Corcoran ethos. There was no mysticism about art in their house. Kevin realized that if acting was just a job, then losing it meant he just needed to find another job. He refused to be the victim of his own success. He refused to be Bobby Driscoll, dying alone in a tenement. He possessed a stubborn Irish resilience that was harder than the diamond Hollywood tried to polish. He looked at the film industry not with the starry eyes of a fan, but with the cold, analytical eyes of a mechanic. He realized that the actors were the least important people on the set. The actors were cattle. They were herded, painted, and sold. The real power lay behind the camera. The real power lay with the men holding the clipboards, the men checking the watches, the men deciding when the sun was right for the shot, the director, the producer, the assistant director. These men didn't have expiration dates. These men didn't get fired because they got a pimple. These men didn't have to be cute. A plan began to form in the mind of the 15-year-old exile. It was a long game, a game of stealth. He would not claw his way back onto the screen. He would sneak around the back of the theater and take over the projection booth. But first he had to become a civilian. He had to deprogram himself. He finished high school with his head down. He kept his circle small. He avoided the Hollywood parties. He avoided the interviews. When reporters called asking, "Where is Moochie now?" he hung up. He let the world think he had vanished. He let the world think he had failed. He enrolled in California State University, Northridge. It was a commuter school, unglamorous and practical. He declared a major in theater arts, but he wasn't there to learn how to emote. He was there to learn the nuts and bolts, lighting, sound, set design, logistics. He sat in classrooms listening to professors lecture about the theory of cinema, professors who had never stepped foot on a real set. Kevin sat in the back row, silent. He had spent 10 years on the most professional sets in the world. He had learned from Walt Disney and Robert Stevenson. He knew more about the reality of filmmaking than the entire faculty combined. But he did the work. He wrote the papers. He took the tests. He was scrubbing the Moochie off his skin, layer by layer. He was earning his right to exist in the world as an adult man, defined not by what he was given, but by what he learned. It was a quiet period, a period of hibernation. But beneath the surface, the tiger was waking up. The industry thought they had seen the last of Kevin Corcoran. They thought they had discarded him safely in the dustbin of nostalgia. They were wrong. He wasn't gone. He was just reloading. The year 1970. The cultural landscape of America had shifted irrevocably. The Beatles had broken up, the Apollo missions were winding down, and the Vietnam War was raging. In Hollywood, the old studio system was gasping its last breath, giving way to the new Hollywood of bearded auteurs and gritty realism. And in Northridge, California, a young man named Kevin Corcoran was quietly earning a degree that he didn't technically need, but desperately required for his own sanity. Kevin graduated from California State University, Northridge, with a Bachelor of Arts in Theater Arts. It was a piece of paper that certified he knew about drama, but his real education had been forged in the crucible of the Disney backlot. Now, armed with the credential of a normal person, he faced the void. He could have walked away entirely. He could have sold insurance. He could have opened a hardware store. Many child stars do exactly that. They flee the scene of the crime and live out their days in suburban anonymity, flinching every time a flashbulb pops. But Kevin had salt water in his veins. The industry was the only home he truly understood. He missed the chaos. He missed the specific high-stakes adrenaline of a film set, the camaraderie of the crew, the impossible deadlines, the magic of creating something out of plywood and light. He realized that he didn't hate the movies. He only hated being the puppet. He wanted to be the puppeteer. He made a decision that baffled his family and his former agents. He returned to Hollywood, but he didn't call the casting directors. He called the production offices. He didn't ask for a script. He asked for a call sheet. He started at the bottom, not the actor's bottom, which involves waiting tables and going to auditions, but the actual bottom. He became a production assistant and eventually an assistant director. The sheer scale of this demotion becomes clear only when examining the rigid caste system of a film set. The actors are the royalty. They are pampered, protected, and catered to. The assistant directors are the sergeants. They are the ones standing in the mud screaming at the royalty to stop drinking coffee and get on their marks. They are the disciplinarians. They are the timekeepers. They are the ones who make the trains run on time. For a former Prince of Disney to voluntarily become a grunt was unheard of. It required a swallowing of ego so massive it could choke a narcissist. Walking onto a set where he once reigned as a star, only to now stand in the mud holding a clipboard, was a daily exercise in humility. But Kevin thrived. He discovered that the skills he had learned as Moochie, the ability to read a room, the intuitive understanding of camera angles, the patience required for long setups, made him a brilliant AD. He knew exactly what the actors were feeling because he had been them. He knew when a child actor was tired. He knew when a director was losing the light. He became a translator between the artistic temperaments and the logistical realities. He returned to the Walt Disney studio in the mid-1970s. But this time, he walked through the service entrance. The studio was in a slump. Walt was dead. The company was trying to find its footing in a changing world, churning out live-action comedies that felt like pale imitations of the glory days. Kevin worked on films like Superdad and The Island at the top of the world. He wasn't on the poster. His name scrolled by in the small print of the credits, unnoticed by the millions who had once worn his face on t-shirts. But he was building something more durable than fame. He was building respect. The crews loved him. He was Kevin, the guy who got things done, the guy who didn't take any nonsense, the guy who could look a screaming producer in the eye and tell him to calm down because he had stared down Walt Disney when he was 6 years old. His rise through the ranks was steady and undeniable. He moved from second assistant director to first assistant director and eventually to producer. By the late 1970s, He was one of the key creative forces behind Disney's live-action resurgence. He was a producer on Pete's Dragon, a film that combined live action and animation in a way that recalled Mary Poppins. It was a massive, complex production involving a giant, invisible dragon. Kevin's logistical genius was essential in making it work. He was the invisible hand guiding the magic. Then came Return from Witch Mountain and the Black Hole. These were ambitious sci-fi projects, Disney's attempt to answer Star Wars. They were technically demanding, expensive, and risky. Kevin was right in the center of the storm, managing budgets, managing egos, and ensuring the vision made it to the screen. There is a profound irony in his work on the Black Hole. It was a dark, brooding film about a mad scientist who refuses to turn back from the abyss. Kevin, the former symbol of sunshine and light, was now orchestrating a journey into darkness. It was a metaphor for his own evolution. He was no longer afraid of the dark. During this period, he also stepped into the director's chair. He directed episodes of Disney television shows, returning to the very format that had launched his career. But when he directed children, he was different from the directors of his youth. He didn't treat them like props. He treated them like colleagues. He protected them. There are stories of Kevin on set, seeing a child actor struggling with a line or looking exhausted. Instead of yelling, he would call cut, walk over, kneel down, eye to eye, just like Walt used to do, and whisper to them. He would tell them it was okay. He would tell them to take a breath. He was the guardian angel he wished he had had when the cameras were rolling on Old Yeller. He was quietly rewriting the rules of the game, creating a safer, more humane environment for the next generation of Moochies. He couldn't save them from fame, but he could save them from the cruelty of the process. But Kevin's ambitions extended beyond the gates of the Magic Kingdom. He knew that to truly kill Moochie, he had to succeed in the real world, the gritty, R-rated world of modern television. In the 1980s and 90s, he ventured out. He worked on shows that would make Walt Disney blush. He served as a first assistant director on hits like Scarecrow and Mrs. King, Quantum Leap, and Murder, She Wrote, mastering the logistics of adult television before ascending to the role of producer on gritty dramas later in his career. His masterpiece of reinvention came in the 2000s with his work as a producer and director on The Shield and Sons of Anarchy. It was the ultimate act of shedding his skin. The boy who played Arliss Coates, the boy who threw rocks at bears in a coonskin cap, was now directing scenes of brutal gang violence and police interrogation. When you watched an episode of The Shield, you weren't thinking about the Mickey Mouse Club. You were terrified. Kevin had mastered the language of grit. He was particularly respected by actors like Michael Chiklis, who described Kevin not as a suit, but as a veteran, a man of few words who led by example because he had survived the trenches. Yet, despite this incredible second act, Kevin remained largely invisible to the public. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write a memoir. He was happily married to his wife, Laura, for over 40 years. They had no children, a choice that some biographers speculate was deliberate. Perhaps he didn't want to bring a child into a world where their innocence could be commodified, or perhaps he simply felt he had raised enough children on screen. He lived a quiet life in Santa Monica and later in Burbank, but the ghost of Moochie was never entirely exorcised. In 2006, the Disney company finally called him home. They wanted to induct him as a Disney legend. It is a prestigious honor, reserved for the titans of the industry. Kevin was wary, but he knew it was a chance to close the circle. The ceremony was held on the Disney lot. Kevin stood on the stage, a gray-haired man in glasses, looking like a kindly professor. Behind him, a montage of his childhood played on a giant screen. Moochie screamed. Arliss cried. Toby Tyler laughed. Kevin watched his younger self with a detached affection. He didn't hate the boy anymore. He pitied him, perhaps, but he also respected him. That boy had paid the mortgage. That boy had endured the pressure. That boy had survived so the man could live. When he accepted the award, he didn't talk about the pain. He talked about the people. He displayed the grace that had defined his entire adult life. But even as he held the bronze statue, there was a sense of finality in his eyes. He was accepting the award for Moochie, putting the character to rest once and for all. He was placing the trophy on the mantle not as a badge of honor, but as a tombstone. Here lies the boy. He did a good job. Now let the man rest. He returned to work the next day. He had a schedule to keep. He had a call sheet to approve. The legend went back to being a worker because Kevin Corcoran knew, better than anyone, that legends don't get the movie made. The people who show up early and stay late do. And Kevin Corcoran was, above all else, the guy who showed up. The silence that surrounded Kevin Corcoran's later life was not an accident. It was an architectural marvel of privacy. In an industry that monetizes every sneeze and stumble, Kevin managed to build a fortress around his personal existence that was virtually impenetrable. This deliberate withdrawal is central to understanding the controversy of the forgotten. Why, when we speak of the great child stars, the Shirley Temples, the Macaulay Culkins, the Judy Garlands, do we rarely speak of Kevin Corcoran? The answer lies in our collective addiction to tragedy. We, the audience, have a morbid fascination with the Icarus narrative. We want to see the wax melt. We want to read the headlines about the DUI arrest, the rehab stint, the messy divorce. We tell ourselves we care, but in truth, we consume their pain as entertainment. It reassures us. If the beautiful boy from the movie screen ends up miserable, then our own ordinary mundane lives feel like a victory. Kevin Corcoran denied us that satisfaction. He refused to crash. He refused to provide the fodder for the tabloids. By living a stable, productive, and happily married life, he became boring to the media machine. He committed the cardinal sin of celebrity. He was normal. This is why history has largely glossed over him. He doesn't fit the tragic archetype, so he is left out of the montage. But beneath this veneer of stability lies a deeper, more complex conversation about the nature of the Corcoran family business. In the modern era, we view the idea of stage parents with extreme skepticism. We have laws like the Coogan Law designed to protect child earnings. We have psychological studies on the trauma of early fame. Looking back at the Corcoran dynasty, 8 children, all pushed into the industry, it is impossible not to ask the uncomfortable question, was this exploitation? Bill and Kathleen Corcoran were not monsters. By all accounts, they loved their children. They were a devout Catholic family. But they were also operating a factory. The children were the raw material. The logic of the household was utilitarian. If you have a talent, you use it to support the family. It was a Depression-era mindset applied to Hollywood glamour. Kevin never spoke publicly against his parents. He never wrote the tell-all book that would have garnered him millions. Mommy Dearest was not his style, but actions often speak louder than memoirs. When Kevin married Laura Solt in 1972, they made a quiet, mutual decision that echoed louder than any scream. They had no children. While we cannot know the medical or personal intimacies of that choice, in the context of his life story, it feels symbolic. The Corcoran line of child actors ended with him. He did not create a next generation of Moochies. He did not drag a toddler to a casting call. He stopped the wheel. It was a silent protest, a declaration that the cost of admission to the Magic Kingdom was too high to ask another human being to pay. This silence extended to his view of his own legacy. For decades, Kevin treated Moochie not as a younger version of himself, but as a separate entity, a twin brother who had died. Colleagues on the sets of Sons of Anarchy or The Shield reported that Kevin rarely, if ever, brought up his past. If someone asked, he would deflect with a polite smile or a self-deprecating joke. "That was a long time ago," he would say. "I was a different person then." This wasn't just modesty. It was a survival mechanism known as compartmentalization. To survive the cognitive dissonance of being a 50-year-old man directing a scene of brutal violence while the world remembered him as a 6-year-old in mouse ears, he had to sever the connection. He had to believe that the boy on the screen was just a character, no more real to him than Mickey Mouse. There is also the matter of his invisible hand. Film historians are often shocked to discover just how heavily Kevin's fingerprints weigh upon the cinema of the 70s and 80s. As we established, he was the logistical general behind complex technical marvels like Pete's Dragon and the experimental darkness of the black hole. Yet outside the industry, these contributions remain invisible. He was the architect whose name was never etched onto the cornerstone. He made the magic happen, but because he wasn't standing in front of the dragon or the spaceship, history has relegated his masterful stewardship to the fine print of the rolling credits. The film's grim tone, its departure from the safe Disney formula, mirrors Kevin's own journey. He was helping the studio grow up, just as he had been forced to. The argument can be made that Kevin Corcoran was one of the most influential figures in Disney's live-action history, not just as a star but as a builder. He helped bridge the gap between the Walt era and the Michael Eisner era. He kept the lights on. He kept the cameras rolling during the studio's most uncertain years. Yet because his face wasn't on the poster, he gets none of the credit. He is the architect whose name is not on the building. The Moochie persona was a double-edged sword that cut him until the very end. Even in the obituaries written after his death, the headlines inevitably read, "Old Yeller Star dies," or "Disney's Moochie passes away." They rarely read, "Veteran TV director Kevin Corcoran dies." It is the final controversy of his life, the theft of his adulthood. The public refused to let him grow up. They froze him in amber at age 10. No matter how much grit and darkness he explored, to the world, he was always holding a slingshot and wearing a backwards cap. However, if we look past the headlines and the sepia-toned clips, the true magnitude of Kevin Corcoran's life comes into sharp focus. And it is a magnitude that has nothing to do with box office receipts or fame. Kevin Corcoran is the anti-tragedy. In a cultural narrative that tells us child stars are doomed, that they must inevitably descend into madness, addiction, or poverty, Kevin stands as a defiant counter-argument. He proved that the curse is not inevitable. He proved that it is possible to walk through the fire of early fame and come out the other side not just intact, but improved. He achieved this not by fighting the system, but by understanding it. He realized earlier than anyone else that Moochie was a product, not a person. And when the market for that product dried up, he didn't crash. He simply switched product lines. He traded charisma for competence. He traded being looked at for doing the looking. There is a profound, quiet heroism in his normalcy. It is easy to be a train wreck. Gravity does most of the work for you. It is incredibly hard to be a functional, happy, productive human being when the world has spent your formative years telling you that you are special, only to later tell you that you are worthless. Kevin Corcoran navigated the most treacherous psychological terrain imaginable. The transition from America's sweetheart to unemployed teenager to working professional without a map. He built the road as he walked it. His life forces us to reevaluate what we consider success in Hollywood. We are trained to think that success means staying famous forever. We think the goal is to be Tom Cruise or Meryl Streep, shining brightly until the very end. But perhaps the greater success is knowing when to leave the party. Perhaps the greater success is realizing that the applause is just noise, and that the silence of a private life is the only music worth listening to. Kevin Corcoran won the game because he realized just in time that it was a game he didn't want to play anymore. He took his chips off the table. He went home to his wife. He did good work. He lived a life that was authentic, connected, and real. As the 2010s approached and his health began to fail, Kevin faced his mortality with the same pragmatic stoicism he brought to a film set. He didn't seek pity. He didn't do a farewell tour. He simply wrapped production on his life. 2015 marked the final, unforeseen, cruel twist in Kevin's life story. At the time he was 66, Kevin was still actively leading the field, a respected director in the industry, and a devoted husband to the love of his life, his wife Laura. However, his body, a tool for acting in his childhood and a vessel for his life as an adult, slowly began to betray its owner. He was diagnosed with colon cancer, an inevitable fate, yet he remained true to his Corcoran self until the very end. There were no fanfares or sympathetic public outcries. He treated his cancer battle with composure, as if it were a meticulously managed production schedule. On October 6th, he quietly passed away in Burbank, the city where he had grown up. It was a peaceful exit, not in front of the cameras, but in the warm embrace of his loving wife and family. The outpouring of support following his death once again underscored the disconnect between his identity and the burden he had carried throughout his life. The crew and colleagues of Sons of Anarchy wailed in grief over the loss of their great mentor and leader, but the world still remembered him as Moochie. The veteran director's obituary featured a video of a 6-year-old boy weeping in Old Yeller instead of a mature 66-year-old. The world seemed to refuse to allow him to grow into adulthood until his very last moments. But Kevin Corcoran's true ending credits aren't on a Texas dirt floor or a funeral parlor, but on a set in 2010. Imagine the aging director sitting in a chair, silently observing a new generation of actors. He gives his final signal into the walkie-talkie, his voice low but firm, yet deeply familiar. Cut. Okay, that's it. Moving on. Without a second thought, he turns off the monitor, leaves the darkened set behind, and walks out the door of reality, bathed in dazzling sunlight, leaving the ghosts of the past forever in the darkness. And so the boy, Moochie, finally fell asleep, and Kevin, the director and human, finally gained eternal life.